regional perspective, and the session will be few, sir, to please come up on the stage.
Good afternoon. Welcoming all of you again in the second session. It's my privilege to act as a moderator of a stalwart like Professor Suranjan Das, because he is a very well-known scholar. No one need any recognition. So I will request Professor Suranjan Das to deliver his lecture. Professor Suranjan Das.
Professor Chakravarti, who had been both a friend and colleague of mine for ages, distinguished members of the House, which includes respected Ambassador Gokhale, my distinguished colleagues, and of course my very dear students. Ambassador Gokhale, when we thought that you would have two separate panels, one on India and China and India and Russia, what was at the back of our mind was a recent article in the Foreign Affairs Journal, which remarked that the two countries which were real victors in the West Asian crisis were first China and second Russia. So we thought that when we were discussing India in a changing world order, perhaps there could be two separate sessions on India's relationship with China and Russia. But today, sir, you amply supported our decision, because when you mentioned first that what would be the future world would be a multilateral world but with strong bipolarity. And second, you rightly mentioned that we cannot escape interdependence but shape interdependence. And in the context of these two important points that you made, and the fact that it also highlighted how China is now the real rising power, we thought that it would be perhaps a good idea to discuss the contours of India's relationship with China. Sir, although when I thought that I would speak on China, I was really hesitant, because I would be speaking in the presence of Ambassador Gokhale, who is an acknowledged expert on China, but so it is in the spirit of learning rather than presenting that I am making this submission. Now, let me start with a particular quote from Harshbi Pant. He noted, I remark, that Sino-Indian relationship remains as complex as ever to decipher, unquote. This relationship has thus been primarily examined in the context of John Spanier's use of the components of conflict, competition, and cooperation to analyze contemporary world politics. But I want to go beyond the conventional wisdom and underline what I see potentials of constructive Sino-Indian bilateralism, which have already sent warning signals to the West. And in doing that, I want to go beyond the conventional wisdom and underline potentials of constructive Sino-Indian bilateralism in the context of what I call sub-regional cooperation, with Eastern India and Bengal as a nodal point. As I begin this submission, I am reminded here of how, while inaugurating a seminar that I had the good fortune of organizing with Professor S.D. Muni at Kolkata University in 2007, when late Pranab Mukherjee had struck the right chord, and I quote, "Bound by 2000 years of history, enriched by a deep tradition of knowledge that goes beyond the boundaries, armed with philosophies that unravel the deepest mysteries of mankind, these two nations, India and China, are at the pointing tip of history. And there's a broad consensus in India that we strengthen and develop friendly cooperative ties with China." Unquote. There is no doubt that the expanding economies of India and China are now poised to cause a tectonic shift in international political economy that could redefine the global economy in a manner the rise of the USA did between the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In quantitative terms, the Indo-Chinese trading relationship, despite a structural imbalance representing a trade balance in favor of China, represents one of the most significant bilateral trade transformations in the contemporary global economy. Even amid the Galwan Valley clash, the bilateral trade crossed $100 billion for the first time in 2021, reaching about $136 billion US dollars in 2023 and a record high of approximately $156 billion in 2025, marking over 12% year-on-year growth. While deep strategic mistrust persists, both states exhibit notable overlaps in how they interpret key questions of global governance, sovereignty, and development. Although their specific positions differ, their underlying critique of Western dominance and a demand for a more multipolar order remain common. The shared perspectives has been articulated in multilateral forums such as BRICS, where both countries collaborate to promote alternative frameworks like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank. But this convergence does not necessarily imply a bilateral alliance, but it reflects, as I see it, a parallel strategic outlook in which autonomy, strategic space, and regional influence are highly valued. Their participation in forums such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization underscores this shared orientation to a substitute regional and trans-regional architecture. On issues like climate change, convergence is visible in their insistence on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Both India and China argue that developed nations should bear historical responsibility for emissions and should therefore take the lead in mitigating the climate change. At the cultural level too, institutional cooperation has been strengthened between two countries. The present Indian government has particularly put culture at the center of its engagement with China, falling back on the legacy of Buddhism and ancient Indian interactions with the outside world. This brings me to the core section of my presentation, which seeks to unfold the potentials of sub-regional cooperation between India and China, especially centering around West Bengal and eastern and northeastern India. I argue that to ensure an optimal utilization of the potentials of positive chemistry in Sino-Indian interactions, we need to go beyond the established Delhi-centric viewpoint and develop a decentralized or desegregated approach to India's foreign policy decision-making process. Why? Because, as Ambassador Gokhale also pointed out, the importance of sub-regional interactions as opposed to regional interactions. Because geographically proximate sub-regional growth triangles can contribute to both promote integration with immediate neighborhood and transnational economic exchange. I submit sub-regional relationship across national boundaries has possibilities of beneficial multiplier effect, as political risks here tend to be localized, traditional constraints can be frozen, and openings can be created for regional solutions as opposed to local, national, and even global problems. Remembering what the leading Indian analyst C. Rajamohan noted, that for a productive Sino-Indian cooperation, I quote, "What is required is balancing geopolitical and economic narratives with a productive approach," unquote. In this context, I submit that eastern and northeastern India, that is Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim, and Tripura and West Bengal, and the neighboring southwestern provinces of China, that is Yunnan, Sichuan, Gizan, Tibet, Guangxi, and the autonomous region of Chongqing can break new grounds for a constructive relationship. The two regions were culturally and economically linked through three land routes. A, the South Silk Route beginning from Siachen through Yunnan, touching India and reaching Persia. B, the Tea Horse Road connecting Yunnan, Siachen, and Tibet across Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal, and India. And C, the modern Steelwell Road constructed during the Second World War connecting Ledo in Assam of India with Kunming of China's Yunnan province through Myanmar. Both the regions are strategically located, serving a hinterland of an emerging market of 400 million people of India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, Myanmar, and Nepal. Both have immense mineral, forestry, horticultural, which lie virtually untapped. And both have a demographic diversity and considerable tourism prospects. Both share eclectic and cultural heritage. Yet the two areas are relatively less developed than the inland areas of the respective countries. It is certainly a paradox that although having a communist-led left-front government for a continuous 34 years, West Bengal's share of China's foreign direct investment has remained lowest compared to other East and Southeast Asian nations. This perhaps reinforces the argument that Chinese foreign direct investment goes wherever it is economically profitable without any ideological consideration. Two processes, I argue. One, New Delhi's earlier Lookist policy and the subsequent Actist policy. And second, China's southward policy with Yunnan as a bridgehead promise new openings for economic linkages between West Bengal and the contiguous region of southwest China. My present submission limits itself to an underlining of the potentials of greater linkage between West Bengal and Yunnan. An entry point for reworking the mutually creative economic connections between the two regions should be the revival of the historic South Silk trade route, which had fallen into disuse following the 1962 Sino-Indian border clash. This land link can be reconstructed through three transport corridors connecting Yunnan of China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, eastern and northeastern India, a blueprint of which was endorsed during the Chinese Premier Li Qiang's maiden visit to Delhi in 2013, with China pledging $40 billion for the Silk Route. But nothing seems to have progressed. However, we need to promote this connectivity because studies have shown that the modern Silk Route could underpin an annual trade flow of $3 trillion. This initiative is also expected to create an integrated Eurasian market linking East Asia, Europe, South Asia, and Africa into a single economic space. Researchers have stressed the multiplier economic effect of even a rail connectivity between Kunming and Kolkata. A Yunnan-India economic corridor can provide India with an access to Chinese and Southeast Asian markets and China with an entry point to South Asia. Encompassing about 1.65 million square meters and touching 440 million people, the corridor will pass through the southern part of West Bengal's North 24 Parganas district, certainly boosting Bengal's economy. Dedicated freight corridors, export processing and special economic zones, industrial parks, and even smart cities in the region could foster direct connectivity between the capital cities of West Bengal and Yunnan, that is Kolkata and Kunming. There was a Kolkata-Kunming famous historic car rally of February-March 2013, in which I was an enthusiastic participant, recreated the conventional overland routes between the two cities. Significantly, China has recently restored the direct Kolkata-Kunming flight. It is estimated that the North Bengal town of Siliguri can be the nucleus of this projected border trade. Available industry and institutional estimates indicate that about 10,000 Indian tourists visit Yunnan annually, a substantial section of which are businessmen from West Bengal going to Dehong prefecture of Yunnan either to sell jewelry or run food business. The commercial city of Ruili in Dehong is now planned to be an eastern jewelry city, and Bengal's commercial magnates should take advantage of it. Incidentally, Kolkata is probably the only Indian city to have a Chinatown. Not unnaturally, India's former ambassador to China, Mr. Ashok Kanta, described Yunnan and West Bengal as, I quote, the engines of the BCIM corridor, unquote. Chinese scholars have recently demonstrated how border connectivity has not only enhanced land trade between China and Myanmar, but resulted in such novel exercises as border fairs, attracting both government and private participants, not only from China and Myanmar, but also from Thailand, Bangladesh, and even India. Connectivity between southwestern China and eastern and northeastern India, centering on West Bengal, should similarly enhance opportunities of trade, communication, and cooperative enterprises in the region. We do not have reliable figures for trade between Yunnan and West Bengal, but the port of Kunming in Yunnan has 132,000 shipment records since 2021, with Kolkata listed amongst its regular partner ports. An indirect estimate suggests the annual West Bengal Yunnan trade corridor is likely in the range of $10 to 50 million. Although this signifies only 0.05% of India-China trade, but potentially the figure is strategic and in sub-regional connectivity terms. Major items of Yunnan's exports to West Bengal are phosphorus, non-ferrous metal, palm oil, hog bristle and chili, while Indian goods traveling to China are chromium ore, iron ore, aluminium, zinc ore, gem, castor oil, tea, food machinery and jute products. The existing West Bengal Yunnan trade basket can, however, be expanded. For instance, Bengal's tea can cater to the rising demand for tea in China. Indian tropical fruits, marine and mineral products, animal and plant drugs, milk and dairy products, beans and oil plants, fish products, goat meat and hides should have a market in China too. While there can be a counterflow of Chinese TV sets, refrigerators, air conditioners, electric rice cookers, rubber, tobacco, and green tea. A 2015 study by Chinese scholars shows how Bengal, being India's leading state in flower trade and international flower marketing, can target yet another relatively untapped item for Kolkata Kunming trade, that is floriculture. Even Bengal's Haldia Petrochemicals, which produces raw materials for polymers and plastic industry, can gain access to the Chinese market through this proposed Bengal-Yunnan trade route. The Bishwa Bangla Store, an umbrella organization initiative of the West Bengal government to promote the region's handloom and handicraft to the international community, must have an appeal in Kunming and other cities of Yunnan. I found this when I visited Kunming at least 3 or 4 times. Again, paraffin, the raw material in candle production, which usually comes from China to northeast through Myanmar, can directly reach India through a Yunnan-Bengal legal trade. Extraction processes from coal reserves in Bengal, representing 10% of the country's coal deposits, can be improved with proven Chinese expertise in the mining sector. A current estimate assesses 3.5% rise in demand for steel in India, 10% of which is to be made by West Bengal. Here again, Yunnan and Bengal can collaborate. Again, if West Bengal accounts for 55% of India's leather exports and houses 20 to 26% of the country's tanneries, China remains the largest producer and consumer of world's leather goods. Sino-Indian joint ventures in Bengal leather industry should be mutually beneficial. The other areas where West Bengal can benefit from Chinese connectivity are forestry and paper. The Forestry Investment Company of Yunnan Investment Group has recently expressed an interest in social forestry schemes in West Bengal, which has the world's most famous mangrove forest, the Sundarbans. West Bengal, having India's second largest paper industry, can also fruitfully collaborate with Yunnan's paper manufacturing units. Bengal can also have collaborative ventures in tobacco, phosphorus, pharmaceutical and chemical industries with Yunnan. Yet, the reopening of the 6th of July 2026, of the historic Nathula Pass, the overland commercial tract between India and southwestern part of China, had raised hopes for a broadened West Bengal's connectivity with southwest China. Yet, some irritants required to be removed to realize the full commercial potential of the Nathula Pass. An expert study of 2005 predicted the trade flow through Nathula to be worth $527 million by 2007, rising to $2.8 billion by 2015. But such hopes have been belied. The total annual value of import-export today and through Nathula Pass is hardly between $6 to 12 million, representing less than 0.1% of the total Sino-Indian trade. The non-realization of the potentials of the Nathula Pass trade largely lies in a failure to develop an open international commercial line, and studies need to be undertaken to address these issues. Studies have referred to prospects of partnership between West Bengal and China in rural industrialization too. Yunnan has successfully implemented the One Village, One Product scheme. This strategy can help Bengal in its drive for higher rural economic growth. The Chinese model of small and medium-sized enterprises in Yunnan may even be a blueprint for Bengal's current search for large-scale employment, investment, and entrepreneurship in the rural sector. In recent years, there has also been some Chinese direct investment possibilities in automobile, computers, and electronics. West Bengal's former Finance Minister Dr. Amit Mitra led a delegation to South Asian Expo in Kunming in July 2015, and in October of the same year, China's Zhongtong Bus Holding Company, based in the East Chinese coastal province of Shandong, proposed in a joint sector model for a bus factory at Ondal, Bengal's industrial upcoming hub in Burdwan district. But the project failed to make a headway because of the changing geopolitical, economic and regulatory conditions. But such industrial exercises can be crucial for an effective sub-regional economic cooperation. Again, West Bengal ranks high in information technology, an expertise which China is keen to tap. In an address to the 4th Kolkata Kunming International Conference at Dali, Yunnan, which I had the opportunity to attend, the president of Kunming High and New Cyber Technology Development Company Limited noted, I quote, "While China engages in hardware outsourcing, India's forte is software outsourcing, and hence the two countries can easily complement each other to find many mutual experience and feelings," unquote. Yunnan is developing now a cyber ecological park and creating an IT zone covering 86.88 kilometers, where Bengal's IT industry should look out for openings. Other potential areas of joint Yunnan-Bengal exercises are disaster and water management, addressing issues of deforestation, soil erosion, etc. A recent study estimates only about 3,500 megawatts of the approximately 90,000 megawatt hydropower potentials of the Ganga-Brahmaputra basin has been tapped, and a Yunnan-Bengal cooperation can result in considerable power generation which should benefit Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar and Nepal. A sub-regional water dialogue is already being talked about and is extremely relevant for Bengal-Yunnan connectivity. Possibilities of bilateral economic connections, which I have just cited, can be co-terminus for Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar tourism circle. Recent literature has stressed the connection between sub-regional tourism and sustainability in widening economic activities and cross-border partnership. A Chinese commentator observes, I quote, "We could utilize the magic of Buddhist culture, derive more specific characteristic routes, such as adventure trip in India Golden Triangle and other routes like the trip to Calcutta, Varanasi, Agra, Jaipur and New Delhi," unquote. Health tourism also offers high potentials of cooperation between China and India. Finally, West Bengal and more specifically Kolkata, with its rich pool of intellectual resources, is well poised to develop a sub-regional academic partnership through student exchanges, joint research, industry academia and cultural interventions. At one time, there was even a talk of fostering, I quote, "a Kolkata-Kunming cultural corridor," unquote. Such initiatives can help the process of breaking the trust deficit in Indo-Chinese relations. I may mention in this connection that when I was the Vice Chancellor of Calcutta University, I could initiate a Ford Foundation-funded New York Kunming Calcutta University project to offer a course on Indo-Chinese experience. Unfortunately, once I left the university, it was stopped. Both Calcutta and Jadavpur universities still have thriving China studies centers, but they are now virtually non-functional due to funding constraints. On the other hand, Yunnan University had now set up the India Research Center and the Indian Ocean Research Institute, while Yunnan's Minzu University and the Fudan University has set up respectively the Yoga Institute and the Gandhian and South Asian Studies Center following the Prime Minister Modi's visit to China in 2015. Bengal should develop collaborative exercises with such centers. This brings me to the concluding part of my submission. My attempted discourse on West Bengal Yunnan corridor retains significance only as a conceptual and policy space. Its weight, I argue, lies not in its current scale, but more in its latent possibilities by offering scholars and policymakers to reimagine India-China relations not merely as a didactic rivalry, but as a layered and regionally differentiated engagement where substantial spaces can play a meaningful role in shaping the contours of Asian connectivity. The discussion has sought to go beyond politico-military or national and stated frames of reference by being essentially deterritorialized in nature. After all, I believe studies on Indian international relations need not stop by portraying what is happening on the ground, but it should also capture possibilities, potential promises, and opportunities for a better world to live in. But to undertake such futuristic exercises, we need the support of think tanks like Chintan Research Foundation, and I can assure the Chintan Research Foundation of Adamas community's steadfast support of such initiatives and exercises if we get support from them. Because in Bengal, frankly, we do not have financial wherewithal to support such initiatives. And given the civilizational nature of a state, about which Shantanu will be speaking later on, India, I think, is best placed to undertake such scholastic endeavors. It was therefore not unnatural for Prime Minister Modi to speak of China and India, I quote, as two bodies but one spirit, unquote. One is reminded of how Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore, during his lecture trip to China in 1924, had unfolded Sino-Indian convergence in cultural and civilizational terms, linked as the two countries were through Buddhism and a shared anti-colonial historical past. Tagore had spent his 63rd birthday celebration in Beijing, and he later expressed his ecstasy thus, I quote from his poem, "Once I went to the land of China, those of whom I had not met put the mark of friendship on my forehead, calling me their own. The garb of a stranger slipped from me unknowing. The inner man appeared who is eternal, revealing a joyous relationship unforeseen. A Chinese name I took, dressed in Chinese clothes. This I knew in my mind. Wherever I find my friend, there I am born anew," unquote. Based on the civilizational intercourse and building upon the growing economic and geostrategic complementarities about which Ambassador Gokhale reminded us, India plus China and not India versus China or China versus India requires to be the guiding spirit for any constructive future discourse on Sino-Indian relationship. And in developing this matrix, the West Bengal Yunnan or West Bengal Southwest China corridor can emerge as a crucial subcontinental nucleus. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful. Yes, I remember this when the India have announced the Look East policy. This was the momentum generated by the government of India. But after the Act East policy, it is vanished because what Professor Suranjan Das have said, that I went twice in China on behalf of Jadavpur University, even his initiative, we have introduced a China Center, it is still there. One of our faculty now, she is working as a faculty in Adamas, she is taking training from China, from Kunming. So these are the initiatives, these are the things that happen. And there are a number of foreign, especially communist countries, they are visiting Kolkata and we are meeting many of them. So nothing to say about the paper which Professor Suranjan Das said. It's a very fantastic paper. But think what I'm thinking, can we linking the connectivity linkage, because this is essential nowadays. Connectivity and civilization linkage is very, very important so far as our domain or foreign policy is concerned. Now, what I feel, it's my personal opinion, it depends on the local government, that is state government and the central government. There's a change of certain mindset of the local government as well as the central government. Central government is not giving priority. Sometimes they are taking decisions. That was happened in the case of Bangladesh, that government of India, without consulting the state government, have more or less Prime Minister Modi visited and wanted to sign the agreement. So our Honorable Chief Minister, he objected that we are the sufferer because of the water river agreement is concerned. That was a mistake. And that is the reason that then the Ministry of External Affairs, now they have introduced a office in Kolkata. There is an office, but now they are functioning better, because until and unless you will talk to the state government, you cannot take a decision. This is a mistake. So it is simply a mindset of the central leadership that you have to consult, because after all, the state is part of your system. So this is the thing which I feel we may not agree with this. Trust deficit is there. It is a trust deficit. Sometimes I'm thinking that China and India, we are the emerging economic power. Why we are struggling each other? So both the leaders, both the countries' leaders, they have to think how to resolve the bilateral tensions, because India's viewpoint is something, one started with border. China said that you have to do the other thing, you have to include. So this is a very, very important point. But what Professor Suranjan Das have said regarding this, the West Bengal Kunming initiative, I think it can again regenerate. The government of India should think, and since our ex-foreign secretary is there, you can think and give a priority towards West Bengal, because West Bengal has been neglected always by the decision makers of the Delhi policy makers. Because West Bengal people are thinking, they have some idea about foreign policy and international relations. So with this word, I have to express my sincere thanks, and I have nothing to say about the paper, because it's a wonderful paper. And is there any question to anyone? One or two questions? Not more than two questions. One question. Shantanu.
Thank you, sir. As the chair has pointed out, and as expected, an excellent coverage of all the factors which go behind in shaping up the sub-regional relationship between Kunming and Kolkata as a part of broader India-China relationship. I thought of adding one point. During Second World War, when Calcutta was a major Allied war hub, the Americans had managed to construct an oil supply pipeline from Bajbaj here in West Bengal right up to Kunming, which continued to survive till the end of the war in 1945. And I have one question. You have been in academic administration for so long. Do you think our understanding of China would increase if the government removes its restrictions on setting up Confucius institutes in Indian education?
Yes, that's a very important. One more question, please.
Well, thank you, Shantanu. The answer is yes and no about Confucius Institute. See, I was a member of the University Grants Commission when this proposal came. Initially, the government of India was quite happy. But then it was found that these Confucian institutes were being run and organized, since it was directly run by the Chinese money, it was not run purely for academic purposes. I would stop at that. So there were a lot of problems. I strongly believe, as Ambassador Gokhale pointed out, our notion of statecraft has changed. We need to go beyond the existing parameters of statecraft and to ensure that there are more people-to-people relationship. Of course, people-to-people relationship, exchanging of people-to-people relationship also depends on the government. But I strongly believe if there is a conscious movement from below, the government at some point of time will come to the argument, will accept the argument of greater people-to-people initiative, particularly if you can convince the government that such sub-regional cooperation will be mutually beneficial between the two countries. I am completely optimistic on that point, and I do believe that there are a lot of potentialities of such convergences, particularly when you go to China and talk to people there. You find a completely different perspective from what the state perspective is. Ambassador Gokhale, I'll just share one personal experience. I had gone to China on a Government of India delegation, and it was in Beijing. We were sitting on the first floor of a hotel where some Chinese folk songs were being played. I had come down and I saw on the pavement a number of Mao Zedong badges were being sold. So I promptly purchased one or two or three. And as happens in government delegations, you are always attached to certain interpreters. So this young Chinese girl with a cutlass English accent, she came running down and saying, "What are you doing, sir? Why have you come down?" I said, "I'm just looking and say at this thing." And I was buying some Chinese Mao Zedong badges. He said, "Why buying Mao Zedong badges?" I said, "He has transformed your country and he is also a source of inspiration to a lot of people in other parts of the world. So I thought I'll just buy some mementos." She said, "I hate Mao." I said, "Are you a member of the Communist Party of China?" She said, "Yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been the Chinese official interpreter for your team." So what I'm trying to emphasize is that there's a complete differential perception between the state and the people. I again want to tell you one story about my experience of going to Pakistan. I was going to Islamabad at that time there was this very popular confidence building measures workshops. I was there in Kolkata University. And sir, as you know that you cannot travel directly from Delhi to Islamabad, you have to go to Lahore and from Lahore to Islamabad. So when I went to Islamabad, the flight was delayed. And when I went to the check-in counter in Lahore, I was told that I have to pay domestic tax for traveling from one place to another even in Pakistan. So I said, I don't have the Pakistani rupee, and if I go back to the bank to convert in rupee, I'll be missing the flight. So at the back of me, there was again a beautiful looking Pakistani girl with cutlass English accent again. So she asked me, "Why are you here?" I said, "I've come to attend a confidence building workshop in Islamabad." She said, "Don't worry, I'll pay for you the domestic tax." But she made a very important point. When you discuss, we think of the people of Pakistan and not the Pakistani state. So this shows, Siddip should know, that there is a complete divergence of perceptions in every country between what the state thinks and what the people think. And I think seminars like this, and I request Priyadarshi to extend support to us so that we can organize more such seminars to bridge the gap between what is taught in Delhi and what is taught in other parts of India. Thank you very much.
So thank you for your enriching session. Now I would request Professor Shobhik Roy, Dean, School of Law and Justice, to come up to the stage along with Dr. Indrani Talukdar. I would request Professor Roy to felicitate Dr. Indrani Talukdar. Now I would request Professor Shantanu Chakraborty to come up to the stage for the felicitation, and I would request Professor Roy to stay back on the stage. Requesting Professor Roy to felicitate Professor Shantanu Chakraborty. এটা কি খোলাই তো আছে পুরোটা আরে একটু Thank you, sir. To enlighten us on the topic Indo-Russian relations today, let us welcome Dr. Indrani Talukdar. The session will be chaired by Honorable Pro Vice Chancellor Professor Radha Tomal Goswami. I would request sir to please come up on the stage.
So, good afternoon to each and everyone, the esteemed audience. So, thank you so much. In fact, thank you for giving me the opportunity along with Suranjan sir. So, this is a very important topic on India and Russia, not only bilaterally, but I also feel globally. And recently I read an article which termed as vertigo in the world order. So the scholar is from Europe, and definitely it was from the European perspective. However, I feel there is a dizziness in the world order because of the shaking and the stirring, of course, by this one man in the US. But I also agree with Gokhale sir in the morning when he said that Trump is just an after effect of the undercurrent which have been there since long. At the same time, I feel that the world order imbalance is felt by the West more because it has been constructed. And I don't want to go more into it because that will divert the whole thing from today's topic. So the current scenario in the world which is facing because of the Iran war or Sudan or Ukraine are not a joke. Many things are happening simultaneously. When it comes to Iran war, on one side, Iran and US is hosting, the second round of negotiations in the coming week in Islamabad. On the other hand, China is hosting some of the countries like Russia, Vietnam, Spain, UAE to discuss on this current situation. In fact, during the meeting between Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, Xi Jinping actually pressed for closer and stronger strategic coordination between Moscow and Beijing. And he also urged to firmly defend their legitimate interests and safeguard the unity of global South countries. Moscow, in turn, also has assured Beijing of its continued support in the global arena. They have also assured China and other countries in the continuation of oil after the US blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which China calls it dangerous. So when the Iran war started, as it is also a member of BRICS, Russia and China condemned, while other countries, including India, they spoke about diplomacy and dialogue and de-escalation of the crisis. Then the frequent meetings and phone calls, the media ops between Moscow and Beijing, since their partnership has reached no limits, might put a question mark on India and Russia's strategic partnership, which has been termed as special, privileged, and time-tested. In fact, day before, we, like India and Russia, we celebrated 79 years of diplomatic relations, as well as 26 years of this strategic partnership. This year we will be. So before leaving, Srinivasan sir in the dining table, he asked me, what do I feel about this relationship, the India-Russia relationship? How should we look at this partnership in this transitional or changing world order, including at the backdrop of Russia-China relationship? It actually made me think very hard. It's not about comparing either India's relations with Russia vis-a-vis other countries or Russia's relation to India vis-a-vis other countries, because we live in the 21st century and a lot has changed. However, this relationship has stood its ground because of its uniqueness and strength despite the challenges. In fact, if we look at the history of India-Russia relations since 1950s, it shows that despite the non-alignment stance of India, there was an affinity towards communism and socialism, which helped both sides take notice of each other. So, addition to this, the US-China-Pakistan nexus and the adversarial feelings towards these two countries also helped them bringing together. Hence, a slow and steady legacy to build that we noticed also was noticed by Washington and Beijing. So the 1971 happened, that on one side a new independent state was formed, and on the other it culminated in the Treaty of Friendship between India and Russia. Both sides provided strong political support, particularly in multilateral forums, and extensive cooperation in defense, civil, nuclear industry, energy, heavy industry, and technology, including in the outer space. This legacy continues to shape the present-day ties, and it has extended to the other new and emerging sectors as well. So in the defense, I don't want to go into details, but what I want to share quickly is that we have moved beyond the buyer-seller relations to development partnership. So BrahMos is one of the examples. At the same time, I would also want to talk about that India, despite the threat of sanctions from the US, it went ahead and procured the S-400, and we have already heard the news, whatever S-400 was able to do during the Operation Sindoor is something worth noticing it. So in the political trust, there is a continuity of it, which is evident in regular high-level exchanges and institutional mechanisms. In fact, we all know that India is going to chair BRICS presidency this year in September, and Putin, president of Russia, he has just confirmed his presence in the meeting. So again, in fact, within a year span, Putin is going to visit India very soon. So this trust on each other also reflects, in many ways, such as Moscow's continued support to India's Kashmir issue, then Putin standing up against President Trump when Trump imposed unfair tariffs on India because it was importing oil from Russia. So there are many, many cases where we have seen that Russia has stood for India, and likewise India has done for Russia. So since Yeltsin's time, when Prime Minister Primakov spoke about the trilateral relationship between Russia, India, and China, it has been noticed that Moscow has wanted India to be a part of the multilateral platforms where it has been a founding member, such as SCO, Eurasian Economic Union, and others. They both are founding members, India and Russia, of BRICS. What is interesting to note here is that in all these three, China is also a member. Somewhere it feels as if Moscow understands India's strategic value and power vis-a-vis China. Moscow and China have adversarial history, which India and Russia do not have. If one focuses on the relationship between Moscow and Beijing, it seems that they both have come together because of the common objective of dismantling Western hegemony. If this was not the case, I feel, then there might have been the continuation of the competition between Russia and China that was there. Why I say so? Because Moscow is not comfortable with China's presence in its sphere of influence or near abroad, like Central Asia or the Far East or the Arctic. It is because of the Chinese tendency of revisionism, whereas Moscow welcomes India's presence in its sphere of influence or near abroad. The Chennai-Vladivostok Maritime Corridor, mobility of migration of Indians in the Far East, and the growing cooperation in the Arctic proves Moscow's comfort with New Delhi and India's push to Russia to expand itself into Indo-Pacific is important to understand from the point of strategic value of each other. So the time-tested phrase has been tested and proved many times, including during the Operation Sindoor or the Ukraine war, despite the diversification in their relationship with other countries, India's with the US and Russia's with China and Pakistan. The trust and transparency in the relationship helps each other to express their uneasiness and discomfort. Till now, it has worked. That can be seen very clearly. However, there is a need to work, evaluate, and rejuvenate the relationship as well. And both sides acknowledge this area, this issue. And in fact, during the last year's annual summit, Moscow agreed to the imbalance in the trade, where it is favoring Russia and not India. The rupee ruble exchange payment system, which has helped Russia and not India, has also been discussed, and they are trying to find out ways to work on it. Unlike Chinese calculation of moving closer to Russia to challenge the US, India wants to balance both Russia and the US, as it understands that both are necessary for the stability in the world. It seems that Russia understands Beijing's strategy, but the deterioration of Moscow's relationship with the West makes it difficult for Russia to leave China. Though if things become good between Moscow and the West, Russia still will not abandon its relationship with China, as history between Moscow and the West, especially the US, is strong. However, there might be lesser dependence as options will be there. A strong Russia with strong relationship with the West looks good for both India and Russia in the case of China. Likewise, a strong India with strong relationship with the West equally looks good for both, again, in the case of China. It is because Beijing has history and contemporary history with both India and China that cannot be overlooked. For example, apart from India-China boundary issues, Russia is uncomfortable with the growing presence of Chinese in the Far East. To make it further complicated, China's partner, North Korea, is also present in this region, the Far East, that does not make it a positive picture for Moscow. In fact, there are many layers in this, Russia, China, North Korea, which I will leave for another day. Maybe I'll come again for another presentation. So for the time being, India and Russia is still on the strong and steady upswing trajectory. The strategic value of each other is still strong. Till now, both sides have been proving to be profitable to each other's national interest as there are convergences. But the changing world order is becoming so unpredictable, hence both have to be careful in protecting the strategic partnership to remain it to be time-tested and special and privileged. Both have to be mindful of not repeating the small window phase where both were leaning more towards the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So with that, really thank you so much for the opportunity.
Hello. Any questions or comments from the audience?
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Afin. I'm from Political Science Department. So my question is with the global politics shifting and Russia is getting closer to China. How can India hold on its ties with Russia without complicating its relationship with the West?
Thank you so much for the question. I think whatever we are looking at, the way Russia and India is still continuing their relationship, including the importing of the oil. And I just mentioned during my presentation that how Putin stood up against Trump. And this is not the first time, but one thing we have to realize and we have to really remember that no matter whatever diversification both India and Russia has with other countries, this is one relationship where India and Russia maintains their time-tested, privileged relationship. And importing of oil, then procuring of S-400, then going forward with the BrahMos. I really feel these are hardcore, examples, including the civil nuclear reactors, which are still going on in Kudankulam. So these are some of the areas where we can look at it, how India has been able to, keep up with the relationship despite everything else.
Thank you, ma'am.
While the discussion is going on, just a single one message not, the news popped out. That is recently the China beat US in the largest trading partner. Just now I got a popped out. I have not a question, kind of a comment from you. As you mentioned about the oil, the energy sector, still India and Russia is a very good supporter, most strong. But if the strategic importance still strong but changing, like Russia remains important for Indian defense, then your energy security, Eurasian geopolitics. But now India is diversifying its partnership, like US, Europe, and Indo-Pacific. So now Russia is still there, but no longer be a major partner. So your comment.
So as I said, I mentioned about it, that of course there will be diversification because we are living in the 21st century, and the pointers which you have mentioned, like there is diversification in the defense area as well. Like earlier it was completely Russian equipments, but now it is 40%, from 60 it has come down to 40%. However, both sides, because one thing we have to understand and realize is that most of the defense equipments of India are still Soviet Union, right? So Russia still has to provide it, and we cannot help it until and unless we do not. Yes, absolutely. So I think India is very nicely balancing all of them. And as I said, that both the countries understand that they also need to diversify. And Pakistan's relationship with Russia has also increased in a way. So, in fact, I still remember like a few years back before COVID, when the news came out that Russia and Pakistan have, cooperated very closely in defense cooperation and all. So India made some noise, but Russia took it very nicely. Similarly, like when Russia has spoken to India about its diversification and all, India has also taken it nicely. And I mentioned it that this transparency which they both still carry actually helps the relationship. Yes, definitely. And as I said, that both at the high level, there are this understanding that it cannot be where it is. It has to be rejuvenated again and again.
Just 2 points. The one point is that recent time the Russia have supplied some equipment to Pakistan, and India has expressed this reservation. Is because of the India has taken too much pro-US stand. That is one point. Second is that some queries. Essentially, the India and the changing global order is essentially a struggle between dollar versus others, because Putin have floated one note. So what is the stand of these, the SCO or the BRICS, whether they can act as an alternative foreign exchange system or international system which can challenge, because it is the dollar they are dominant. Can you highlight on some of these points?
My question, good afternoon. My question is slightly different. So, at the current backdrop of the US-Iran war and an alleged act of force that has been used, and rightly so, because this was not an act of self-defense from the US. And with the first negotiation already failing, how do you think the mutual expectation of India and Russia under the current circumstances will be of each other in navigating this particular aspect? Because in the morning there was a very important talk that was delivered, and I felt that having China as an ally is very important, but at the same time, under the current circumstances, the Indo-Russian expectations of each other under this current situation, how does it affect the relationship between the two states?
So, because I've already answered about the defense thing, where India had expressed its discontentment when Pakistan and Russia, strengthened its defense cooperation. So, one thing I really feel that there are certain things which cannot be avoided. Like for an example, we understand that Russia and US relationship is not good, yet we are diversifying, right? So somewhere we expecting Russia to also do something similar to that. I think let's be very practical, because we talk about pragmatism in foreign policy. So I really feel that let's not read too much into it and create more issues, because one thing is it that in MEA, because of the dialogues which keeps happening in a regular basis, it's very transparent, and both sides understand the issues very well, and they also know where is the red line, and they will see to it, both sides, India and Russia, that they will not cross that red line, because their strategic interests are converging and has always converged. So that is my first point to you. We spoke on the de-dollarization and the Putin's payment system and all. I really feel that de-dollarization, I don't know, I leave it to the experts of the economic. But for another currency to come up, the alternate currency, if we take BRICS only, forget every other member, but will China accept a Russian currency? Let's leave India and others. Yeah? But will China accept it? Will Russia accept it if China comes up? So I think for some time, de-dollarization and all, these are some things which are just coming up. Of course, we should not avoid, but first and foremost, I think the house has to be kept in order first to go about in another way out. And for you on the negotiation, of course, I think someone said that China and Russia, Suranjan sir actually said that, China and Russia are coming out as the big victors of the Iran war. But at the same time, and many have been questioning about India's silence in it. And in fact, I have mentioned about the BRICS aspect also, that Russia and China condemned, while India did not condemn, but it talked about dialogue and diplomacy and de-escalation. So point is, maybe we might find that there is divergences between India and Russia and all. But in a very recent seminar on BRICS, someone very nicely pointed, and it remained with me. Condemnation doesn't mean that there is unity. It might not have been, like everybody might not condemn a particular thing, even if there is a kind of an institution. What is important is the actions which they take. Now, if you look at India and Russia, including in the Iran war, we don't see that there are divergences. It's not that they are fighting against each other. Oil is still happening, like there are still dialogues. And in fact, today in the morning, Lavrov has said that apart from continuation of oil to China, they are willing to also ship to other countries. Now, other countries also mean India. And we all know that India is exporting the oil in big time now. So I think, thank you.
So, this is the last question, because already we are running out of time. So kindly.
Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. So my one simple question, do you see the upsurge of right-wing politics around the world is also impacting the changing world order? If it is yes, then to what extent?
Thank you so much. I think I am the only person who have generated so many questions. This is a very interesting question about how far right, it is. Is it impacting? It's a little bit tough to answer it because it's a very. It can be black and white. It's a very gray zone, but I will try to answer from the Europe perspective. So, if we see, there has been this clash for some time about pushing out the liberal world order. Yeah? And that is why we see the rise of right-wing parties even in Europe. However, and in fact, it's very interesting because when the right-wing parties started to emerge in the Europe, so there was also this another kind of propaganda, maybe we can say, that Russia is coming closer to those European countries who have this right-wing leaning. But the elections in Europe has shown that there is again a pushback in the right wing. So it's not about right wing or left wing or anything. In fact, recently I have written a paper on this aspect itself, where Hungarian Prime Minister, who is not from the right wing so what I have argued is it's not about which political leaning, it is about the people suffering. Which leaders are really looking into it? Who are providing the answers to it? And I think this current world order which is happening, like let's say how Trump is going around. Initially, and in fact, Gokhale sir also spoke about that there is going to be a deep polarization which is already there, which cannot be undone even after Trump leaves. So if you look across the whole world, this is the same similar scenario everywhere, barring some of the few countries. However, what has happened is, any side is not able to cater to the people's suffering. They are not being able to. So I really feel that, I know it's not a very straightforward answer I'm giving, I'm just going round and round. But what I'm trying to say is, I think it's high time not to look at world order, the solution of world order, from right wing or left wing or whatever, liberalism, whatever. Let's leave that. When we talk about human centric, like India is in the forefront, it's really talking about that it has to be an inclusive growth for everyone. Not only global south but also global north, because I really feel that's the wisdom of India, because we have also understand that if we leave global north, there will be another set of problems, which won't help us. So taking along everyone is actually the right way to, come up with a solution for the world order, which might not be right wing or left wing, but it will be human centric. I don't know how much I can answer this, but a good topic for research, definitely.
Join me to congratulate and thank you to the speaker. It's a wonderful session. Over to Koshu for the next session.
Thank you, ma'am, for your enlightening session and discussion. Next, we shall invite Professor Shantanu Chakraborty, Professor of University of Calcutta, to enlighten us on analyzing India's rise in the global order. Is an Indic interpretation possible? The session shall be chaired by Professor Shivaji Pratim Bosu, Distinguished Research Professor, Adamas University. Sir, please come up on the stage.
Good afternoon. This is probably the last, if I'm not wrong, the last session of this wonderful and very insightful conference or seminar. And the last but not the least speaker, Professor Shantanu Chakraborty, is going to present something different. What we have been listening from morning till this time, it is about something very, kind of a cultural take also. Because there will be something cultural. Because the title of the paper is Analyzing India's Rise in the Global Order. And there is a question, is an Indic interpretation possible? So is an Indic, so that is from the point of view of the India, it is politically, culturally, is it possible? So I am also very intrigued to know from Professor Chakraborty, learn from him, and so I invite him to present his paper. Please, Professor Shantanu Chakraborty, please give him a big hand.
Well, thank you, Professor Basu. Let me begin by thanking the organizers and Adamas University for their kind invitation. It is always a pleasure to visit this university. Now, since morning, we have been hearing about the changing global order. It's changing to some of us. The global order faces a crisis situation, according to many more. Now, when we discuss and when we are discussing the current changes in the global order, and along with it, the other major theme being the decline of the Western liberal international order, this is something which has taken the Western world by a storm. If the UNDP report of 2022, for instance, regards the current changes as an uncertainty complex having three critical layers. One, dangerous planetary change. Two, transition to new ways in organizing industrial societies. And three, intensification of political and social polarization. Now, this global disorder, another scholar points out, manifests itself in at least 4 dimensions within the liberal international order, which has been evolving since the end of the Second World War. And these 4 dimensions are: 1, its normative foundations, its institutions, its policy areas, and the poor management of conflicts. Now, what is this all being attributed to? If you look at Western media, if you look at Western scholarly articles, writings, etc., it's being attributed, this assault, this crisis within the liberal international order is usually being attributed to loss of traditional Western order and rise of non-Western powers, who are still basically regarded as outliers. China and Russia, to some extent, India also. Now, the other point to note is there is also increasing criticism against Western theoretical models, paradigms, and there are steady attacks on Western scholarship as to their failure in explaining what is causing or what is behind this crisis. As a result of which, and this targets not only universities, it is targeting think tanks also. To give you one example, a UK-based firm, Cast from Clay, for instance, has recently reported that but they have conducted an opinion poll, and the survey reveals that only 20% of Americans trust their own think tanks and their findings. What are the alternatives? The alternatives project towards a greater hybridization of the knowledge structure. Within social science, for instance, you have developments like mixed methods research and intersectionality. Both these approaches encourage greater heterogeneity and borrowing from alternative knowledge funds. Within IR, more specifically, projected universalism and exclusivity have been criticized recently by scholars like Rudra Seal and Peter Katzenstein, for instance. Katzenstein has developed a new theory which he calls analytic eclecticism, in which borrows a lot of non-Western traditional ideas, etc. And he says these are essential in trying to explain the global situation in its reality. You have another example of a Taiwanese scholar settled in America who died a few years back, Lili Ling, for instance, who also has written a lot about hybridity. Lili Ling, about 6-7 years ago, tried to show in one of her work as to how you could use Taoism and Taoist principles in trying to explain present-day global situation and crisis. Now, this brings us to our question. Is an Indic paradigm possible, or could you have Indic versions which could fit as better explanatory categories in order to explain present-day crisis? Now, why I'm saying this? Ambassador Priyadarshi in the morning was talking about that good diplomacy in present times of crisis is like driving a car in a busy Indian alley without blowing your horn. I would say that when we try to look back at some of these indigenous paradigms, many of which have been historically constructed during colonial times, it's like starting using his example, I would say why it's time to look back at history, because just before starting a car, you need to look back through your looking glass whether anything is behind. Nowadays, many people use camera also, but probably it's a good time to sit back and this is something because Indian scholarship, had started experimenting with some of these ideas during colonial times. If you look at the developments during early 20th century, but more specifically during 1920s, 1930s, and even just before independence till 1940s, you had individual scholars like Binoy Kumar Sarkar, Taraknath Das, for instance, who have been experimenting with some of these ideas. You also had institutional approaches. The Indian Political Association, for instance, was set up in 1938, and if you look at some of the first issues of their journals till 1947, some of the articles in the Indian Political Science Journal began to focus on these issues. You also had an interesting debate going on between the Indian branch of the Chatham House, the Indian Institute of International Affairs, which was finally set up here in 1936. And that was, of course, very much dominated by the colonial government, as a result of which the Indian nationalists projected a new institution, the Indian Council of World Affairs, ICWA, which comes up in 1943. Now, throughout late 1930s and 1940s, you had a struggle between these two institutions. Both had their own journals, and if you look at, many of these focus on immediate issues, etc. But some of the articles, etc., began to focus on theoretical issues. Because we don't have much time, what I will do here is I will pick and choose some of these topics to see whether these could have any relevance as explanatory categories in trying to explain the present-day international crisis which we face at a time when traditional or established Western theories, Western models do not seem to be seem to have any adequate answer for these. Now, let me take up one of them. The first topic I will take up is the Arabic term fitna, which basically means disorder or collapse. Now, interestingly, if you see as students of history, and the Vice Chancellor would remember, fitna is a term which we associated with rise of Maratha Empire. You had an eminent historian, Andre Wink, who used this term to explain how the Maratha Empire, cut away the base of the Mughal control in Deccan, India, and began to establish its own control. Now, and fitna is a term which was used very frequently in contemporary Mughal documents to explain a sort of disorder within the empire because of all these rebellions, etc., going on anywhere. Curiously, if you look at present times, look, for instance, the Pakistani press or the Pakistani government releases, the term fitna is back into use. For instance, the Tehreek-e-Taliban, that organization is now being referred to in Pakistan officially as Fitna al-Khawarij. The Balochi groups, for instance, are being referred to as Fitna al-Hindustan, because apparently they receive a lot of help from the Indian Secret Service. But fitna need not only convey a state of complete disorder. As Andre Wink has shown in his explanation of the rise of the Maratha Empire, that a sociological explanation could also be could be attempted, which could dispense away with the pejorative and negative connotations of fitna. Now, I leave you with this tempting question: could fitna be one term to do away with this essential dualism between order and disorder? And could we arrive at a better explanation using this term, having non-Western origin? Let us go back to other areas, and this is something which has been already tried out by Indian scholars during 1920s and 1930s. Binoy Kumar Sarkar, for instance, he writes that you could explain realism by looking at classical Indian texts and Puranas. He, for instance, argues that the realism could be explained within the doctrine of Matsya Nyaya, reflecting total anarchy where the strong devour the weak. The doctrine assumes and is prepared for a world of eternally warring states, while in the internal sphere, the ruler tries to end Matsya Nyaya, disorder, through danda, which he explains as enforcing his rule. The anarchy prevailing in world politics, I'm quoting Binoy Sarkar here, reflects conditions reflecting Matsya Nyaya. The ancient Indian thought, however, did not end with the realist picture of a Matsya Nyaya or a world in total anarchy. The doctrine of Mandala, argues Sarkar, while acting as a centrifugal force, was counteracted by the centripetal tendencies of the doctrine of Sarvabhauma. Sarvabhauma, according to Binoy Kumar Sarkar, in modern times, he was writing in 1930s, could mean different things. To him, for instance, the concept of Sarvabhauma could indicate federal nationalism, imperial federation, he was referring obviously to the League of Nations, or the universal state. And that is thus a keystone and the arc of the Hindu theory of sovereignty. He was not alone. Let me quote another scholar, M. Yamunacharya, who writes an article in the Indian Political Science Journal in 1941. And in his article, while analyzing Nitisara by Kamandaka, another classical Indian text, he comes to the conclusion that in order to escape from Matsya Nyaya, safety lies for these states being drawn into the mandala, whereby small and weak states would be able to participate in the strength and safety of the bigger states, which include them under their sphere of influence. And obviously, another reference to the League of Nations, which was still not in enough trouble. Now, very recently, you have other scholars who have attempted such Indic versions. Deepsika Sahi, for instance, is one scholar who has recently projected the Indian philosophical concept of Advaita, monism, as a possible intellectual tool which could be used in IR. Shahi contends that the study sets out to inaugurate a scientific metaphysical project in the academic discipline of IR that could restore the missing connectedness amid artificially installed dualisms between the scientific phenomenal and metaphysical nominal worlds. Now, enough of theorizing. What about implementing? Even if you adopt some of these ideas, the question remains of implementing and using this within your diplomatic circle. Now here, you have a word of caution from another scholar, Manjari Chatterjee Miller, who was writing on some of these post-revisionist states. Her book essentially referred to China and India as emerging global powers. And Manjari Chatterjee Miller argues, she cautions us that in case of these states like China and India, you have to remember that these countries suffer from what she termed as PII, post-imperial ideology. As a result of which, and what is this post-imperial ideology? She argues that this comprises a sense of victimization that brings with it a dominant goal to be recognized and empathized with as a victim. And how do you do it? This along drives two subordinate goals. One is of maximizing territorial sovereignty. Just see what China is doing. And two, this is more relevant for today's paper, maximizing status. Now, in case of India, if you look at, there is of course a greater use of more, Sanskritic ideas, Indic contextualization after Narendra Modi has come to power in 2014. In the electoral manifesto of BJP, for instance, which came out in 2014, in case of foreign policy, they said the BJP will replace Panchashil with Panchamrit. And what are Panchamrit? Samman, number one, which means dignity and honor. Two, Sangbad, which means greater engagement and dialogue. Samriddhi, which means shared prosperity. Suraksha, which means regional and global security. And five, Sanskriti evam Sabhyata, cultural and civilizational linkages. And again, there was a lot of invoking of history. Prime Minister Modi himself, during one of his tours in Kolkata in 2020, for instance, he cited from Tagore's well-known Bharatbarsher Itihas, History of India. And he cited in his speech from Tagore and said, in his 2020 speech, India's history is not that what students study for examinations. Some people came from outside, killed their own relatives, brothers for their sake of throne, is not our history. I don't, of course, have to elaborate on frequent use of terms like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, India's projection as a Vishwa Guru, how India's tradition of collaborative living could set an example for a world in crisis and all that. Now, what has been actual implementation of all these? Now, you may, when we talk of implementation, we may talk about specific instances, and of course, you have to talk about greater issues. Now, if you look at specific instances of real implementation of Indic principles, etc., number one is, of course, UN recognition of 21st June as World Yoga Day, which has this government counts as its own achievement. Two, if you look at Antiquities and Art Treasures Act of India, which has been in operation for long, which basically tries to prevent stealing or trying to get back India's artifacts, paintings, statues of historical origins which had been taken away during colonial period or later. Now, if you look at history till 2014, this act has been here since 1950s, Nehru's time. Till 2014, in spite of this act being in existence, only 13 antique pieces were returned to India from abroad, where they had been illegally transported. And if you look at the history between 2014 till 2020, I don't have the data after that, 228 ancient pieces have been restored back, have been returned back to India, which the government, of course, claims as a big success. We are also talking in terms of religious diplomacy. Foreign Minister Jaishankar's speeches have been much quoted. I wouldn't elaborate here, but very recently he's talked about Angkor Wat temple complex, how Indian government is helping in its restoration. The opening up of Tiruketishwaram temple at Mannar, after it had been closed down for nearly 13 years in Sri Lanka due to the Tamil Civil War. The establishment of the Ramayana circuit, the Buddhist circuits, etc. Of course, all these have had criticism. That of this government more interested in projecting a Hindutva the approach in global diplomacy also. I will just quote one such critic, Gauri Pathak, who argues that remixing usually is to dress up older compositions in the aesthetics of the contemporary in order to introduce them to a new generation or audience as a form of soft Hindutva and an emerging theme in India's nation branding. This is selective, sanitized, and idealized Brahmanical Hindu discourses and praxis, which are translated into civilizational wisdom and a cultural ethos for consumption by audiences not just in India but also abroad. Now, of course, you have counter arguments also. I wouldn't quote established so-called pro-Hindutva scholars here, but I would probably I would use counter arguments used by scholars established abroad who are not really proponents of Hindutva. Cynthia Brokaw and Alison Bush, for instance, argues that unlike in China, the state in India has rarely exerted the same kind of control over the historical record found in modern China. If you look at the Chinese tradition in Mongolia today, Genghis Khan's name, the Mongolian inscriptions, etc., have all been but erased. Susan Rudolph, for instance, another well-known scholar who has been writing on Indian foreign policy for a long time, writes that the fact that Sanskrit is a language used for articulating many of the texts that constitute Hinduism does not detract from its role in constituting Indian civilization in the sense of a pluralist composite civilization. David Frawley, another person, it says, in the present world context, the Hindu or Indian idea of civilization and culture is overlooked. Therefore, Hinduism must project its entire dharmic view, its unique vision of the universe, God and humanity, rather than simply respond to the side issues framed by the Western mind. My argument would be, is this something entirely new which has come after 2014? If you look at the document prepared in 2012, for instance, when a previous government was in power, this is Non-Alignment 2, a document prepared by a group of scholars, retired diplomats, etc., very close to the then Congress government, and it was published by Center for Policy Research. I will just cite from Non-Alignment 2 document. All of India's great leaders, Gandhi, Tagore, Nehru, Ambedkar, had one aspiration, that India should be a site for an alternative universality. But as India ascends the world stage, the question will be asked, will India be like great powers of the past, or will it set new standards in moral and ideological leadership? India must remain true to its aspiration of creating a new and alternative universality. Now, I wouldn't go into much of the debates as to what is this alternative universality going to be all about. But, to conclude, I would argue that, of course, there are, in spite of attempts, first of all, it's still hazy. You do not really have very much government efforts in trying to build up a solid Indic vision of Indian foreign policy making. That is still absent. In fact, I will give you one example. Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, which is MP IDSA today. About 5-10 years back, two of my colleagues had started building up a massive project on Kautilya and Kamandaka's Niti Sada, which had, IDSA is funded by Ministry of Defense of Indian government. It began to get funding from other sources also. You had external scholars who got involved in this project. It came out with 1 or 2 monographs, but then after a new director general has come, that entire project has been stopped, and the people who are working in that project has been dismissed. So it's not that you have a solid Indic approach. I think the problems essentially in developing an Indic version, though the possibilities are there. This is something which is of historical heritage, but the problems, I guess, are 2. One, that our policy making is still, or our bureaucracy is still has inherited, there has been a lot of colonial inheritance, which imparts a general conservative approach towards the Indian state's approach, as a result of which trying to push in anything new, even if it is an so-called Indic version of Indian foreign policy making or India's place in the global order, even that faces tremendous amounts of administrative, financial and other difficulties. The second problem is that when we are talking, when we are engaging ourselves with these alternatives, are we doing it on our own, based on our own traditions, or we are doing it simply because there is a cue from the West? Why I am saying this? Because, 2014 onwards, you have a lot of think tanks within India which are sponsored by the West. You have the Indian branch of the Carnegie Foundation, you have Stimson Center's branch. In fact, if I just take up one topic, somebody there was talking about the maritime dimensions of India's foreign policy. One of the previous speakers has spoken about that. Now, there has always been an alternative version of that. V. Surya Narayan, the doyen of Indian maritime research and all that, since 1960s and 70s, he has always been very critical of the American area studies approach. And he says that this segmentizes our entire Indo-Pacific in a major way. This is an American strategic approach, and we, Indian scholars, shouldn't have adopted it. But if you look, there has been a change. If you look at Carnegie Center, that was one of the first center which began to project a Bay of Bengal initiative within the Indian Ocean dimension, etc. Now, do you focus on Bay of Bengal? I'm just giving you as an example, just because the Americans now think it to be strategically very important. Or there are a lot of historical or other social science works related to Bay of Bengal. You could look at it as an, definitive, or you could take a connectivity approach connecting South and Southeast Asia. You could take a historical approach and all that. But if you look at the publications from Carnegie Center, which has worked on Bay of Bengal initiative, these essentially do not focus on the historical factors at all. These essentially began to project Bay of Bengal as a very important strategic zone, which basically could be used to counter China at some stage. So I would say to conclude, I would say that there are possibilities of developing an Indic version. You have had historical examples. You could use some of these examples to build up a new version which would be more appropriate for present times, but I do not see it happening immediately. And in spite of whatever the critics of Hindutva thinks, I think because of the essential conservative nature of the Indian state, and two, because some of these new ideas are being projected by some of the Western scholars, and whatever work in India is being done is mostly being done because of that. Unless we could develop an indigenous vision of our own, and we could translate it into a proper projection of our Indian foreign policy, I don't think developing an Indic version is going to be, is going to work, or at least going to take a very, very long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Shantanu, Professor Chakraborty, for your very in-depth, very, although inward-looking, but very, it's a basic something you have spoken, which reminds me that just few weeks earlier, we have in this university, in this auditorium, we have organized one, session on reimagining political thought, reimagining political thought from, and Naumita is smiling, yes, reimagining political thought from the Indian and the global perspectives. So there we wanted to find out if we can develop certain, we are absolutely dominated by the Western thought, and everything Western is masqueraded as universal, quote unquote universal, and how to decolonize our minds. So to quote from Viku Parekh, can we decolonize our minds and develop certain, and I also in a small paper I also attempted to, if we can at all, develop certain ideas which will be evaluative and explanatory and will fit into which will explain today's realities. Can we do it? So it's a very interesting paper, Shantanu. It's a very, I think you should publish it. I don't know whether you have published it or not. It's a very interesting paper, and Shantanu has very rightly, he has pointed out about the hybridity of today's world, and also the concepts, and conceptually also it should be very hybrid kind of our ideas, perception, etc. And I think, why not? If China can continue with its Confucius, and then it has not abandoned Confucius. It has not abandoned the Tao or Dao philosophy. And they are combining it, while even when M.N. Roy and other from Comintern went to went to China to make Mao Zedong to understand something, and then they said that we are following the Chinese path of Marxism, which is something indigenous. Why can't we do it? So by following something indigenous, trying to attempt something, to develop something as Indian, indigenous, we do not, this is the mindset, that might brand us as something saffronists or something Hindutvadi. So we are not, by not doing that, not following that, can we develop? So Shantanu has, proposed something, and also questioned that whether we can do it or not. the house is, and Suranjanda, when Suranjanda was not there, but I appreciated what you have said earlier, that we need people-to-people connection. That is also very important for that tech. And I remember that I was to some extent very close to one initiative called PIPFPD, that is Pakistan India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy. I.A. Rahman, the head of human rights of Pakistan, he was also a member. We, Rano Bidda and others, we all, Shoboshachi Boshurai Chaudhuri, we all took part in it. So this can be possible, sir. That is also from, people to people. So that is also an approach. That is very good approach. Despite this media propaganda and almost making China as a devil, presenting China as a devil, we can do. So very interesting paper, Shantanu. The house is now open for discussion or questions, but you should be very brief in your question, because Shantanu, we must allow Shantanu to give his answer. So 2 or 3 questions, please. Please raise your hands there.
Hello, good evening to all respected professors and all my fellow mates. My name is Ankit Raj Shah. I am a PG final year student of Public Administration and Governance, hailing from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. It has indeed been a very profound and enriching experience, sir, to be a part of this conference. My question to you, Santanu sir, is we are witnessing right now the growing influence of multiple cultural and ideological narratives in global politics. When we talk about China, it presents its civilizational state model, and West basically presents its rule-based operation, the model of a rule basis. Where does India situate itself in this ideological competition, sir?
Well, thank you for that question. When you talk about civilizational state model, there is not a single type of a civilizational state. China, the Chinese version seems to be more popular because China talks about it. The Russians also talk about unique civilizational, it being a unique civilizational state. You also have debates within Russia. There is one version in which it claims it's not a fully European state, it's a Euro-Asian state. Okay, there is another version, popular, which is popularized by a section of scholars who argue that we essentially draw our concept of civilization, etc., from German scholars of 19th and early 20th century. Okay, so but in any case, it opposes the what it conceives to be Western capital liberalism as projected by United States and Western Europe. Okay, so it depends on, and India, it has been projected. So even if India projects itself to be a civilizational state, this is going to be a different sort of a civilizational state projection than what China. In case of China, first of all, China is more uniform than India. I think you have nearly 94% Han population there. And whatever instances of minority is there, you have we have been talking about Kunming. You have a large concentration of people in that region, for instance. But if you look at their treatment, etc., it's not very encouraging. Similarly, I wouldn't have to go into details as to what Chinese state does to the Uyghur population and in other areas. So this is a civilizational state which tries to uniformize. Much more, more interestingly, if you look at, and this also leads to greater confrontational possibility with its neighbors. So it's an aggressive civilizational concept. If you look at Chinese disputes, for instance, with countries in Southeast Asia, with Japan, with Korea, for instance,
China always claims these to be historically belonging to it, which were snatched away from China during the century of civilization. And there seems to be a continuity. In 1914, for instance, you had a Chinese delegation. Remember, the Communist Party was still not in power. The Kuomintang governments had sent a delegation to British India to discuss about the northeast frontier, etc. And the claims that Arunachal Pradesh was part of southern Tibet was raised also by the Kuomintang government representative also. Similar arguments, what this the present day government saying. So history is used very strategically in case of China. In India, because it's much more diverse, etc., it's very difficult to really project a uniform civilizational set. So even if India tries or attempts to project herself as a civilizational state, this would be unique in an Indian sense of way. It cannot compete or compare with that of China.
Thank you, sir.
Well, good evening, sir. I am Koshani Shah from Political Science Department, and I'm currently in third year, pursuing my undergraduate. So my question would be, can the Indic concept of dharma provide a more ethical framework for global governance than the current Western rule-based order?
That's a difficult question to answer, because if you look at how the concept of dharma has been used within our historical or Puranic tradition, not everything which has been done in the name of dharma could exactly be termed as ethical, using the Western conceptualization of the term. These are different approaches. The idea is to see, of course, the Western model is going to dominate, but because of the failure of these Western models, the attempts also began in the West. You had several scholars trying to use different, I talked about Lili Ling using Taoist principle, whether you could use it in framing Ayah laws, etc. There were other, in India, there is a historical tradition of scholars trying to project a sort of Indic vision. But, you could attempt, but whether it's going to be universally accepted, because if you want to, a principle needs to be universally accepted. Currently we could say that the overall dependence on the West, probably because it's coterminous with the decline of the West in material terms also, militarily as well as economically also. So, of course, the sort of your ideological projections, etc., are going to be important because of that. A lot of, it's sort of, you could frame it culturally also. If you look at the way, look at the Western universities now, for instance, there is there are a lot of students who are taking up Chinese as a foreign language course. A lot of students go there are a lot of ties with Chinese universities, etc. There is a lot of demand for South Korean courses, South Korean cuisine, by the way, South Korean pop music is becoming very popular in the West. So similarly, Northeast also. So all these, it's a sort of, if you want to have it like that, a war of concepts going on. Whether it is going to be universally accepted, forget universal acceptance. If it's going to be accepted by a majority of the people, we are still not sure, because this is something which has just been initiated. This is more or less a post-1990s development. Our strength is we have had historical tradition. This is not something which we are attempting since 1990s. This is something, we have a history behind it. The idea is whether we are interested in
proper implementation of this. You could do it in various ways. Just use the term dharma, vasudhaiva kutumbakam, in a document which basically projects realism in the Western IR sense. Or you could really adapt these in trying to do a new framework by yourself. But that's a difficult task. Whether it's possible by policymakers, I have doubts on that.
Kita, you or anybody? No? Okay. So thank you so much, Shantanu. So I now looking forward to the announcement of the, yes. Should we go down? Should we go down?
So it's okay. So we are on the verge of ending the program. We are almost at the culmination point of the program, but it won't end unless and until we have a vote of thanks from the Dean of School of Liberal Arts and Cultural Studies, Professor Dr. Joy Das.
Good evening, everyone. Respected dignitaries, eminent scholars, distinguished speakers, my colleagues and my dear students. As we draw the curtain on this intellectually vibrant seminar on India and the changing world order, it is both an honor and a privilege to propose the vote of thanks. Indeed, today's deliberations have proven that ideas are the currency of the future, and we have been truly enriched. At the very outset, I extend my deepest gratitude to our esteemed Honorable Chancellor, Sir, Professor Dr. Shomit Roy, whose visionary leadership and compelling chairman's address reminded us that in times of global flux, institutions must rise to the occasion and steer the ship with both wisdom and foresight. I offer my sincere appreciation to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Sir, Professor Suranjan Das, whose inspiring welcome address set the ball rolling for a day marked by insight and engagement. His commitment ensures that Adamas University continues to push the envelope in academic excellence and global discourse. I convey my heartfelt thanks to Sri Shishir Priyadarshi Sir, President of the Chintan Research Foundation, for his gracious inaugural address and for joining hands with us in this meaningful collaboration. As the saying goes, I quote, "Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success," I unquote, and we look forward to it. We were indeed privileged to hear from Sri Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary of India, whose keynote address was both enlightening and thought-provoking. I can't help but mention the small anecdote. It is one of the finest lectures I have heard in recent times. His insights helped us connect the dots in understanding India's strategic positioning in a rapidly shifting global landscape. I also extend my sincere thanks to Mr. K. Srinivasan Sir. He was also the former Foreign Secretary of India, for chairing the session with remarkable depth and clarity. The post-lunch technical session was truly showcased a meaning of minds and the meeting of minds. I extend my sincere gratitude to our distinguished speakers, Dr. Indrani Bagdar, Fellow, Chintan Research Foundation, Professor Shantanu Chakraborty, and Professor Suranjan Das, for their special presentation whose contributions added layers of nuance and perspective to our discussions. I'm equally grateful to our esteemed session chairs, Professor Tridip Chakraborty, Professor Radhatamal Goswami, and Professor Shivaji Pratim Basu, sir, for steering the discussions with intellectual finesse, ensuring that every idea found its rightful place and every voice was heard. Behind every successful event, there are countless hands working endlessly. I extend my warmest appreciation to the program coordinator, Dr. Ankita Roy, whose dedication ensured that everything went off without a hitch. A special word of thanks to our gracious compares, Dr. Ankita Roy again, and Dr. Kaushai Banerjee, whose eloquence and poise added sparkle to the proceedings and kept the audience hooked from start to finish. I would also like to acknowledge the invaluable contributions of our faculty, members, and administrative staff, whose behind-the-scenes efforts ensured that everything ran like a well-oiled machine. Finally, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to all the participants and attendees. Your active engagement was truly made today's seminar a feast of ideas and a platform for meaningful exchange. As we conclude, let us remember the words of Nelson Mandela. I quote, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." I unquote. With renewed insight and collective resolve, may we continue to engage, reflect, and contribute to shaping and navigating through a balanced and inclusive global order. With sincere thanks to each one of you, I conclude. Thank you. Jai Hind.